Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 deeply unsettling stories about neighbors. The people who live right next to us, separated by just a wall or a fence, close enough to hear our conversations, see our routines, know when we're home and when we're not. These aren't stories about noisy neighbors or petty disputes over property lines. These are real experiences from real people who discovered that the person living next door wasn't just unfriendly or eccentric. They were dangerous. Before we dive in, I want to know, have you ever had a neighbor who made you uncomfortable? That feeling of being watched through the windows, those encounters in the hallway that felt just slightly wrong? Drop a comment and share your experience. Because sometimes the scariest threats aren't strangers breaking in, they're the people who already have access to where you live. What you're about to hear will make you look at your neighbors differently, make you more aware of the thin boundaries between homes, and remind you that proximity doesn't equal safety. Alright, let's begin. And remember, every word of these stories is true. Story 1. The Man in Apartment 3B. This happened about 5 years ago when I was living in a cheap apartment complex in Denver, Colorado. I was 24 at the time, working as a receptionist at a dental office, barely making enough to cover rent and student loans. The apartment complex was one of those places that looks decent from the outside but reveals its problems once you actually live there. Thin walls, unreliable heating, a landlord who'd take weeks to respond to maintenance requests. But it was cheap and it was mine, and at that point in my life that was enough. I lived in apartment 3A on the 3rd floor. It was a studio, just one room with a tiny kitchenette and a bathroom. Small but manageable for one person. The apartment directly next to mine, 3B, had been empty for the first 2 months I lived there. I actually loved having that empty unit next to me. It meant I only had to worry about noise from one side. But in late September, someone moved into 3B. I first became aware of my new neighbor on a Saturday morning when I heard furniture being moved around. Lots of heavy scraping sounds, things being dragged across the floor. I didn't see the actual move-in happening. I was at work during the day. But when I came home that evening, I noticed the door to 3B was now marked with a doormat that said, "Welcome," in faded letters. I didn't meet my new neighbor right away. Days went by without any real interaction. I'd hear occasional movement through the wall, footsteps, a TV playing quietly, the sound of cabinets opening and closing. Normal apartment sounds. Nothing concerning. My first actual encounter with him was about a week after he moved in. I was coming home from work around 6 p.m., walking down the hallway toward my apartment with my keys in one hand and my phone in the other. As I approached my door, his door opened. The man who stepped out was probably in his mid-40s, maybe 45 or 46. Average height, slightly overweight, with graying hair that was starting to recede. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and a button-down shirt that looked like office attire. He looked normal, completely unremarkable. "Hi there," he said with a friendly smile. "You must be my neighbor. I'm David." He extended his hand for a handshake. "I'm Sarah," I replied, shaking his hand briefly. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Welcome to the building." "Thanks," he said. "Still getting settled in. This is a nice place though. Quiet." We chatted for maybe 2 minutes, just the kind of polite small talk you have with neighbors. "Where are you from? What do you do? How do you like the area?" He seemed friendly, pleasant. Maybe a little awkward socially, but not in a threatening way. Just someone who didn't seem super comfortable with casual conversation. The encounter ended naturally. We both said it was nice to meet each other, and I went into my apartment. I didn't think much of it. He seemed like a perfectly normal neighbor. But things started getting weird about 2 weeks later. I began noticing that every single time I left my apartment or came home, David would appear in his doorway within seconds. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. We were neighbors after all. We kept similar schedules. It made sense that we'd run into each other sometimes. But it kept happening. Every single time. If I left for work in the morning, I'd step into the hallway and within 5 seconds, I'd hear his door open behind me. He'd emerge with a friendly smile and walk to the elevator with me, making small talk. If I came home in the evening, I'd be unlocking my door and I'd hear his lock turn. He'd step out, acting like he'd just been about to leave, and we'd have another brief conversation. If I went out to take out the trash at 10 p.m., he'd somehow appear in the hallway moments later. After a week of this, I started feeling uncomfortable. The timing was too consistent to be coincidence. It felt like he was listening for my door, waiting for me to leave so he could intercept me. But I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just lonely. Maybe he was new to the city and trying to make friends. Maybe I was being paranoid. Then I started noticing him in other places. I'd go to the grocery store on Saturday mornings and I'd see him there. Same store, same time, even though we'd never discussed our shopping routines. I'd go to the coffee shop down the street on Sunday afternoons to read, and he'd walk in 15 minutes later. He'd act surprised to see me as if it was a coincidence, but it happened 3 weeks in a row. I started varying my routines, going to the store at different times, choosing different coffee shops, but he'd still show up. One evening, I was sitting in my apartment watching TV when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was David's voice, coming through the wall. But he wasn't talking on the phone. He was talking to someone in his apartment, having a full conversation. Except, I never saw anyone else enter or leave his apartment. He always seemed to be alone. I turned off my TV to listen more carefully. She came home at 6:17 today, I heard him say, 15 minutes later than usual. She must have stopped somewhere. There was a pause, like he was listening to someone respond. But I couldn't hear another voice. Just silence, then David speaking again. No, she was alone. She's always alone. I told you she doesn't have a boyfriend. I've been watching carefully. My stomach dropped. He was talking about me. He had to be. She went to the gym on Tuesday, he continued. Wore those black leggings. The ones that. I couldn't listen anymore. I grabbed my phone and went into my bathroom, the room farthest from the shared wall, and sat there with my heart pounding. He was tracking my movements, documenting my schedule, paying attention to what I wore. I felt violated in a way that's hard to describe. My home was supposed to be my safe space, and now I knew that someone on the other side of the wall was obsessing over my every movement. I called my best friend and told her everything. She insisted I needed to report this to the landlord or the police. But I hesitated. What would I report? That my neighbor was talking about me in his own apartment? That he showed up in the hallway at the same time as me? That I'd seen him at public places like grocery stores and coffee shops? None of it was technically illegal. Creepy, yes, but not illegal. Still, I decided to at least tell the landlord. Maybe David had a history. Maybe other tenants had complained. The next day, I called the property management office and explained the situation as calmly as I could. The woman I spoke to, Patricia, the property manager, listened patiently. Has he threatened you in any way? She asked. No, not directly. But he's clearly watching me, tracking my movements. Has he entered your apartment without permission? No, but. Has he damaged any of your property? No, Patricia, you're not understanding. He's obsessed with me. He talks about me when he's alone in his apartment. He times his exits to intercept me. He follows me to stores. There was a long pause. Then she said, I understand this is making you uncomfortable, Sarah. But without a specific lease violation or illegal activity, there's not much I can do. I can talk to him if you'd like, but... No, I said quickly. The idea of her confronting him, of him knowing I'd complained, terrified me. No, don't talk to him. Forget I called. I hung up feeling helpless and more frightened than before. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the wall I shared with David's apartment, wondering if he was on the other side doing the same thing. Around 2 a.m., I heard his door open and close. Footsteps in the hallway. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, listening. I heard breathing on the other side of my door. Just breathing. For what felt like several minutes but was probably only 30 seconds. Then the footsteps moved away back to his apartment. His door opened and closed. I got up and checked my door. The chain was on. The deadbolt was locked. But I didn't feel safe. I grabbed my phone and took a photo of my door from the inside, just to have some kind of documentation that I'd been awake and aware at 2 a.m. The next morning, when I opened my door to leave for work, there was something sitting on my doormat. A photograph, printed on regular printer paper. It was a picture of me, walking to my car in the parking lot. Taken from behind, but clearly me. I recognized my coat, my bag, my hair. Written on the back in neat handwriting, "You look beautiful when you don't know anyone's watching." I felt like I was going to be sick. I took the photo back inside, locked my door, and called the police. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later. I showed them the photo, explained the pattern of behavior, told them about the conversation I'd overheard through the wall. They took it seriously, which was a relief. They went next door and knocked on David's door. I watched through my peephole as he answered. He looked confused, concerned even. The perfect act of an innocent man being questioned by police. The officers talked to him for a few minutes in the hallway. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw David shaking his head, gesturing with his hands in that way people do when they're explaining themselves. After about 5 minutes, the officers returned to my apartment. He says he doesn't know anything about the photo, one officer told me. Says he's barely spoken to you beyond friendly hellos in the hallway. He's lying, I said desperately. He talks about me in his apartment. He follows me. He's obsessed. The photo is concerning, the officer acknowledged. But we can't prove he took it or left it there. The hallway doesn't have security cameras. There's no physical evidence. What am I supposed to do? I asked, trying not to cry. You can file for a restraining order, he said. But you need to demonstrate a pattern of behavior in court. Document everything. Keep a log of times and dates when he follows you or makes you uncomfortable. If he contacts you directly, save those messages. And consider moving if possible. They left and I felt more alone than ever. I started documenting everything. I bought a cheap security camera and pointed it at my door. I logged every time I saw David in the hallway, every time I noticed him at stores, every unusual sound from his apartment. But David seemed to know I'd reported him. His behavior changed. He stopped appearing in the hallway. Stopped making small talk. If we did cross paths, he'd look away quickly and hurry past. To anyone else, it might have looked like the problem had resolved itself. But I knew better. He was just being more careful. 2 weeks after the police visit, I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound. My doorknob was turning. Slowly, carefully. Someone was testing it to see if it was locked. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 without even turning on a light. Someone's trying to get into my apartment, I whispered to the dispatcher. The doorknob stopped moving. I heard footsteps retreating quickly down the hallway. Police arrived within 5 minutes, but whoever it was, and I knew it was David, was back in his apartment with his door closed. The officers knocked on his door. He answered looking sleepy, wearing pajamas, acting confused about why police were there again. Were you just in the hallway? They asked. No, I've been asleep for hours, he said. Is everything okay? They checked the hallway. No security cameras, no evidence of anyone trying my door except my testimony. He's going to kill me, I told the officers. I was crying now, unable to hold it together anymore. You need to do something before he kills me. Ma'am, we understand you're scared, one officer said gently. But we need evidence to make an arrest. He hasn't actually broken any laws that we can prove. I strongly suggest you file for that restraining order tomorrow and consider relocating. I moved out 3 days later. Broke my lease, paid the penalty fee I couldn't really afford, packed everything I owned in one frantic day, and moved in with my friend until I could find a new place. I never saw David again. Never went back to that building except once, a month later, to collect a security deposit check from the property office. When I drove past that building, I looked up at the 3rd floor. At the window that had been mine. The window next to it, David's window, had the curtains open. And he was standing there. Just standing in his window. Watching the parking lot. I don't know if he saw my car. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my check and left. To this day, I don't know what David wanted. What his plan was. What would have happened if I'd stayed. I just know that I've never felt safe in an apartment building since. I rent a small house now. No shared walls. No neighbors close enough to hear through the walls or know exactly when I come and go. Because the scariest part isn't what David did. It's what he could have done. How close I came to finding out what happens when a door finally opens in the middle of the night. Story 2, The Family Next Door. This happened when I was 15 years old. My family, my parents, my younger sister Emily who was 12 and myself, had just moved into a new house in a suburb outside of Portland, Oregon. It was one of those newer housing developments where all the houses look similar. 3 or 4 basic designs repeated over and over, just with different colors and slight variations. Our house was a 3-bedroom, 2-story place with a small backyard. It was significantly nicer than the apartment we'd been renting, and my parents were really proud to finally own a home. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets, well-maintained yards, kids riding bikes, people walking dogs. The American suburban dream. The house directly to our right was occupied by a family that seemed nice enough. The Hendersons, Mark and Janet, and their son Kyle who was around my age. My mom met Janet within the first week. They had a conversation while both were getting mail, and Janet seemed friendly. She invited our family over for a barbecue the following weekend to welcome us to the neighborhood. My dad thought it was a great idea. Good to get to know the neighbors, he said. Especially since we're living right next to each other. That Saturday we walked over to their backyard around 5 p.m. The Hendersons had a nice setup. A big grill, patio furniture, string lights hanging between trees. Mark was manning the grill when we arrived. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2 inches, with dark hair and an athletic build. He looked like someone who might have played football in high school and still worked out regularly. Welcome, welcome, he said enthusiastically, shaking my dad's hand with that overly firm grip some men do to establish dominance. Glad you could make it. I'm Mark. This is my wife Janet. Janet appeared from the kitchen carrying a bowl of pasta salad. She was shorter, maybe 5 feet 4 inches, with blonde hair and a friendly smile. She looked like she could have been a cheerleader back in the day, very put together, perfect suburban mom aesthetic. So nice to meet you all, she said warmly. And you must be. She looked at Emily and me, clearly trying to remember our names. I'm Jessica, I said. This is my sister Emily. What lovely girls, Janet said. Our son Kyle is around here somewhere. Come say hello. Kyle emerged from the house a moment later. He was about my height, maybe an inch taller, with his dad's dark hair. Reasonably good looking in that generic way teenage boys can be. Hey, he said with a slight nod, hands in his pockets. The adults chatted about boring adult things, property values, schools in the area, recommendations for contractors and landscapers. Emily and I mostly stayed quiet, and Kyle disappeared back into the house after about 10 minutes, apparently having fulfilled his obligation to make an appearance. The barbecue itself was fine. Nothing remarkable. We ate burgers and hot dogs. My dad and Mark talked about sports. Our moms discussed some neighborhood book club. As we were getting ready to leave, Janet mentioned that Kyle would be starting at the same high school as me when school started in 2 weeks. Maybe you two could walk together or carpool, she suggested brightly. Since you're neighbors. I smiled politely but internally cringed at the idea. Kyle seemed fine, but I wasn't exactly eager to be forced into a friendship just because our parents bought houses next to each other. When school started, I saw Kyle in the hallways occasionally. We'd nod at each other in that acknowledgement way you do with people you vaguely know. But we weren't in any of the same classes and didn't really interact beyond that. Emily, however, started spending time with Kyle, which surprised me because he was 15 and she was only 12. But apparently he'd been helping her with math homework, which she struggled with. My parents thought it was sweet. What a nice boy, my mom said, helping out his younger neighbor. I found it slightly odd but didn't think much of it. Different kids mature at different rates. Maybe Kyle just got along better with younger kids. But about 2 months into the school year, Emily started acting differently. She became quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped wanting to hang out with her friends from school. She'd come home and go straight to her room. At first, my parents thought she was just being a moody preteen. But I noticed other things. She seemed jumpy, anxious. She'd flinch if someone touched her unexpectedly. One night, I found her crying in her room. When I asked what was wrong, she just shook her head and said she didn't want to talk about it. Did something happen at school? I asked. Are kids being mean to you? No, she said quietly. It's not school. Then what is it? She looked at me with these frightened eyes and started to say something, then stopped. I can't tell you. He said something bad would happen if I told. My stomach dropped. Who said that? Emily, who are you talking about? But she wouldn't say anything else. She just kept crying and asking me to leave her alone. I didn't leave her alone though. I sat with her until she cried herself out, and then I went to our parents and told them something was seriously wrong. My dad brushed it off initially. She's probably just dealing with normal teenage drama. She's 12, Dad. And this isn't drama. She's scared of someone. She said he told her something bad would happen if she told. That got their attention. My mom sat Emily down and gently tried to get her to open up. It took almost an hour of careful questioning, but Emily finally broke down and told us. Kyle had been touching her inappropriately. It started with what seemed like accidental touches, brushing against her, putting his hand on her lower back to guide her somewhere. Then it progressed to him cornering her in our backyard, touching her chest and between her legs while telling her it was normal and what older kids do. He told her that if she told anyone, his parents wouldn't believe her. That her parents wouldn't believe her. That everyone would think she was lying and causing drama. That she'd be the one who got in trouble. And she believed him. Because she was 12 years old and he was 15 and seemed confident and authoritative. My parents were horrified. My mom started crying immediately. My dad's face turned red with barely controlled rage. How long has this been happening? He asked, his voice tight. A few weeks, Emily whispered. I tried to avoid him, but he kept finding ways to be alone with me. My dad stood up and headed straight for the door. Where are you going? My mom asked. To talk to Mark Henderson. Shouldn't we call the police first? I'm going to deal with this neighbor to neighbor first, he said in a tone that left no room for argument. I watched from our living room window as my dad walked across the lawn to the Hendersons' house and rang the doorbell. Mark answered, and I could see my dad talking animatedly, gesturing with his hands. Then Mark's expression changed from confusion to anger. He stepped outside and they had a heated conversation on the front porch. After about 5 minutes, Mark went back inside and returned with Kyle. My dad pointed at Kyle and said something I couldn't hear, but Kyle shook his head and crossed his arms. The conversation escalated. Mark got defensive, stepping between my dad and Kyle. My dad's voice got louder. I could hear it through our closed window but couldn't make out words. Then Janet came outside. She looked between my dad and her husband, confused and concerned. My dad gestured back toward our house, clearly explaining what Kyle had done to Emily. Janet's hand went to her mouth. But then Mark said something sharp to her and her expression changed. She crossed her arms and shook her head. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They were defending him. They were going to protect their son instead of acknowledging what he'd done. My dad came back to our house looking furious and defeated. They don't believe it, he said. Mark said Kyle would never do something like that. Janet said Emily must have misunderstood innocent interactions. They accused me of trying to cause trouble because, I don't even know why. They just won't accept it. We're calling the police, my mom said firmly, and we did. 2 officers came to our house that evening and took Emily's statement. It was traumatic for her, having to recount everything that happened, providing details, seeing her parents cry. The officers explained that they'd investigate, talk to Kyle, talk to his parents. But they were also honest about the challenges. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence. It would come down to he said, she said. These cases are difficult, one officer admitted, especially with juveniles. Even if charges are filed, prosecution is complicated. They did investigate. They talked to Kyle, who denied everything. Said Emily had a crush on him and was making things up because he'd rejected her. Said she'd been the one acting inappropriate toward him. His parents backed up his story completely. They painted Emily as a troubled kid with an overactive imagination. They suggested our family was trying to sabotage their reputation in the neighborhood. The detective assigned to the case was sympathetic but realistic. Without physical evidence or witnesses, this is very difficult to prove, he told my parents. I believe your daughter. I've seen enough of these cases to recognize the signs. But belief isn't the same as proof. No charges were filed. The investigation closed as inconclusive, and we still lived right next to the Hendersons. My parents considered selling the house and moving, but we'd only been there a few months. We'd lose money. And why should we have to leave? We were the victims here. Instead, we built a fence. A tall privacy fence between our properties. My dad installed security cameras facing our backyard and the side of our house. We avoided the Hendersons completely. If we saw them outside, we'd go back inside. If they tried to talk to us, we'd ignore them. The Hendersons, for their part, seemed to embrace their role as the wronged party. Janet spread rumors through the neighborhood that we were difficult neighbors who'd made false accusations against their innocent son. Some neighbors believed them. Some were sympathetic to us. Most just wanted to stay out of it. Emily transferred schools the following semester. She didn't want to be in the same building as Kyle, seeing him in the hallways, knowing that everyone whispered about the accusation that hadn't gone anywhere. She started therapy. She developed anxiety and trust issues that lasted for years. And every single day, we had to live next door to the family that had protected their predator's son over a 12-year-old girl he'd victimized. We stayed in that house for 2 more years. 2 years of carefully timed exits and entries to avoid running into the Hendersons. 2 years of Emily being afraid to play in our own backyard. 2 years of my parents' simmering rage at the injustice of it all. When I was 17 and getting ready to leave for college, my parents finally sold the house. Took a financial loss but didn't care. They couldn't stay there anymore. I'm 24 now. Emily is 21. She's doing better. Therapy helped, time helped, distance helped. But she still has nightmares sometimes. Still has trouble trusting people. Still carries the trauma of not only what Kyle did, but what his parents did by refusing to believe her. We don't know what happened to the Henderson family. Don't care, honestly. I just hope Kyle didn't have access to other young girls. That some other family didn't have to go through what we did. But the scariest part of this whole story? The Hendersons seemed like a normal, nice family. The perfect neighbors. And that's the point. Predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the friendly family next door with the nice lawn and the barbecue and the welcoming smile. And sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't a stranger breaking in. It's the neighbor you trusted enough to let your guard down. Story 3: The Woman Upstairs. This story happened when I was 28 years old. I was living in a 2-story duplex in Austin, Texas. One of those older converted houses where the landlord split it into two separate units. I lived downstairs in a one-bedroom apartment. The upstairs unit was technically a studio, smaller than mine, with a separate entrance accessed by an exterior staircase. For the first 6 months I lived there, the upstairs unit was occupied by a grad student named Marcus who I barely ever saw or heard. He was quiet, respectful, paid his rent on time according to our shared landlord. The perfect upstairs neighbor. But Marcus graduated in May and moved out immediately after. The upstairs unit sat empty for about 3 weeks before someone new moved in. I was at work when the new tenant moved in, so I didn't see it happen. But when I came home that evening, I noticed the upstairs lights were on and I could hear footsteps above me. The footsteps were heavier than Marcus's had been. Slower. There was something about the rhythm of them that felt almost deliberate. But I shrugged it off. Different people walk differently. No big deal. A few days went by before I actually encountered my new neighbor. I was taking out my trash one evening around 8 p.m. when I heard the upstairs door open. I looked up and saw a woman descending the exterior stairs. She was probably in her 50s, maybe late 50s, with long gray hair that hung loosely around her shoulders. She was very thin, almost unnaturally so, and she moved with this strange, stiff gait. "Hello," I called out, trying to be friendly. "I'm Natalie. I live downstairs. You must be the new tenant." She stopped on the stairs and stared at me. Didn't smile, didn't wave, just stared with these intense, unblinking eyes. After several uncomfortably long seconds, she said, "Margaret." Just that. Just her name. Then she continued down the stairs, walked past me without another word, and disappeared around the building toward the street. I stood there feeling unsettled by the interaction. Or lack of interaction, really. But I told myself she was probably just socially awkward or shy. Not everyone is comfortable with neighborly small talk. Over the next few weeks, I'd occasionally see Margaret coming or going. She kept odd hours, sometimes leaving at 2 a.m., returning at 4 a.m. Sometimes I wouldn't see her for days. And the sounds from upstairs were strange. Not loud but constant. Footsteps pacing back and forth at all hours. The sound of furniture being dragged across the floor at 3 a.m. Sometimes what sounded like things being dropped, heavy thuds that would wake me up. I considered complaining to the landlord, but Marcus had made noise too sometimes. That's just what you deal with when you live in a converted duplex with thin floors. Then things started getting genuinely weird. I began finding things in my apartment that I didn't remember purchasing or bringing home. Small things at first, a coffee mug I didn't recognize in my cabinet, a book on my shelf that I'd never bought, a different brand of dish soap under my sink. At first I thought maybe I was just forgetting. Maybe I'd bought these things while distracted and didn't remember. Memory is fallible. But the items kept appearing, and they were getting more personal. I found a pair of women's underwear in my laundry that wasn't mine. Different size, different style. I definitely hadn't bought them. I found a toothbrush in my bathroom that wasn't the one I'd been using. When I opened my medicine cabinet, there was a prescription bottle with Margaret's name on it sitting on my shelf. That's when I knew for certain. She was somehow getting into my apartment. But how? I kept my door locked. Always. I checked it obsessively. And there was no sign of forced entry, no scratches around the lock, nothing. I called my landlord and explained the situation. He seemed skeptical. "You're saying Margaret is breaking into your apartment and leaving things there?" "Yes. I found her prescription medication in my medicine cabinet. Why would that be there unless she put it there? Maybe it was left over from a previous tenant? It's dated from 2 weeks ago, and it has her name on it." He sighed. "I'll talk to her. But Natalie, I need you to understand that these are serious accusations. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong." He said he'd look into it, but I could tell he thought I was being paranoid. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the footsteps above me. Back and forth, then they stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the noise. Then I heard it. A creaking sound. Like a floorboard being stepped on. Inside my apartment. I sat up in bed, my heart instantly pounding. I lived alone. There should be no creaking sounds except the ones I made. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight function, pointing it toward my bedroom door. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, was a figure. Margaret, standing completely still, just watching me. I screamed. Couldn't help it. Pure instinctive terror. She didn't move. Didn't run away or react. Just kept standing there in my doorway. "Get out!" I yelled, scrambling out of bed on the opposite side, putting it between us. "Get out of my apartment right now." She tilted her head slightly, like a curious bird examining something interesting. "You have my things?" she said in that same flat voice I'd heard when we first met. What? You have my things. In your cabinets. In your drawers. You took them. You put them there. You've been breaking into my apartment. She shook her head slowly. This is my home. You're the one who doesn't belong. I grabbed my phone and started dialing 911. That's when she finally moved. She turned and walked calmly toward my front door, unlocked it from the inside and left. Just walked out like she'd been a guest leaving after a nice visit. I ran to the door and locked it behind her, then shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. I explained everything, the items appearing in my apartment, finding Margaret standing in my bedroom doorway, her bizarre claim that this was her home. They went upstairs and knocked on Margaret's door. No answer. They knocked louder, identified themselves as police. Still nothing. The lights are on, one officer noted, and I can hear movement inside. They knocked again, threatening to force entry if she didn't respond. Finally, the door opened. Margaret stood there looking confused and concerned. Yes, officers? Is something wrong? Ma'am, we have a report that you entered the downstairs apartment without permission. Margaret's eyes widened in what looked like genuine shock. What? No, I would never do that. I've been home all evening. I haven't left my apartment since this afternoon. The tenant downstairs says she found you in her bedroom. Margaret shook her head. That's not possible. I've been right here. She must have had a nightmare or something. Poor thing. The officers looked at each other, then back at me. Ma'am, one said to me, is it possible you were dreaming? You said you were in bed when you saw her. I wasn't asleep. I was fully awake. She was standing in my doorway. She spoke to me. What did she say? She said I had her things. That this was her home. That I was the one who didn't belong here. The officer wrote this down, but I could see the skepticism on his face. They checked my door for signs of forced entry. Found none. The lock was intact, no scratches, no damage. How would she have gotten in? The officer asked. I don't know. But she did. Maybe she has a key. They asked Margaret if she had a key to my apartment. She denied it. They asked if they could search her apartment. She agreed readily, stepping aside to let them in. I waited downstairs while they searched. When they came back, they looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, we didn't find any evidence that she's been in your apartment. No stolen items, no key to your door, nothing suspicious. But she was there. I saw her. We believe that you believe you saw something, the officer said carefully. But there's no evidence a crime was committed. If you're concerned about your safety, you might consider installing a deadbolt or a chain lock. And maybe talking to your landlord about changing the locks just to be safe. They left and I felt completely helpless. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had my lock changed immediately. Paid for it myself rather than waiting for the landlord. I installed a chain lock too and a door security bar, one of those things that wedges under the doorknob. That night I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. I kept expecting to see Margaret standing in my doorway again. Around 3 a.m. I heard footsteps in my apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps in my living room. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped. I crept to my bedroom door and looked out into the living room. Nothing. No one there. But I heard breathing. Definitely breathing. Close by. I looked up. There, in the corner of my ceiling where it met the wall, was an opening. A small access panel to the crawl space between floors that I'd never noticed before. And peering down at me through that opening were two eyes. Margaret's eyes. She'd been in the crawl space, above my apartment, the entire time. I ran. Didn't grab anything, didn't pack, just ran straight out of my apartment in my pajamas and got in my car. I drove to a friend's house and called the police again from there. This time they took it seriously. They went back with flashlights and searched the crawl space. They found a makeshift living area up there. A sleeping bag, food wrappers, a flashlight, and dozens of photos of me, taken through that access panel. Photos of me sleeping, eating, watching TV, all from that ceiling vantage point. Margaret was arrested that night and charged with stalking, trespassing, and burglary. Turned out she had a history of this. She'd been evicted from 2 previous apartments for similar behavior, obsessing over downstairs neighbors, breaking into their units, claiming their homes were actually hers. She had severe mental health issues that had gone untreated for years. The landlord apologized profusely and offered to let me break my lease without penalty. I took him up on it immediately. I never went back to that apartment. Hired movers to pack up my stuff while police were present. I live in a single-story house now. No one above me, no crawl spaces, no shared walls. But sometimes when I'm home alone at night, I still find myself looking up at my ceiling, checking the corners, making sure there are no access panels. Because the scariest thing about neighbors isn't just their proximity, it's that sometimes they're closer than you think. 3 people. 3 neighbors who seemed normal at first. 3 situations that escalated from uncomfortable to dangerous. I want to thank everyone who shared their experiences. Neighbors are supposed to provide a sense of community and security, but sometimes the threat is literally on the other side of the wall. If you found these stories compelling, please like and subscribe. And if you've ever had a neighbor situation that made you feel unsafe, drop your story in the comments. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps others recognize warning signs before it's too late. Stay safe out there. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And remember, locks only work if the threat is outside. When the threat is already living next door, you need to be even more vigilant. Until next time.